Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I mean, people are still signing in. I mean, we're now at 225, but apparently some over 400 of our members are going to be joining us this afternoon. And again, I welcome all of you. Thank you for taking the time to join us today to talk about the government protocols that have been released that we have been a part in the development of. But I just, again, welcome all of you. I hope everybody is well, healthy, remains healthy and well, and that we will see all of each other sooner than later on a set or an art department or an editorial space in the near and close future. So welcome, everybody. I hope that we can answer questions to your satisfaction. And I will hand off the microphone to Annie Bradley, who is your DGC Ontario second vice chair, and she is going to guide us through and make the introduction to the other folks on the panel. So thank you very much. I hope it is useful and beneficial to all of you, and gives some comfort into the world that we're entering. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us as we talk about the protocols outlined in Section 21, the COVID protocols outlined in Section 21. For those of you who are just coming on, we're up to 281 people now. My name is Annie Bradley, and I'm a member of the Directors Caucus in the DGC, and I currently work at your service as the second vice chair on the board of DGC Ontario. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are broadcasting from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and later the treaty territory of the Mississauga of the Credit River. We acknowledge the treated and untreated land that all of us are inhabiting at this moment. Toronto and the rest of Ontario is still home to many Indigenous people, and we are glad for the opportunity to live and work on this land. I would also like to say that we acknowledge the imbalances long endured by many of our BIPOC and LGBTQ+ colleagues, and we stand with you in allyship against racism, violence, harassment, and all forms of discrimination. We hear you, we are listening, and we look forward to working together to strengthen our membership's diversity and inclusion. Thanks. So before we begin, I just want to talk a little bit about protocols today, before we start talking about protocols. And that is, we do have our Q&A open. We do have staff members working behind the scenes. If you have any last minute additional questions, we hope we get to them. But I want to thank the over 100 people who submitted through our thought exchange. We've got your questions and over 1,800 votes on those questions, putting them into an order. And we're going to do our best today to answer those questions and to give you the information that is outlined in Section 21, which was recently released. And we have two incredibly knowledgeable people to help us through this journey. And that is Cynthia Clayton, our senior business agent for DGC Ontario, who was a Section 21 Film and Television Health and Safety Advisory Committee member, and Jayson Mosek, who is the business agent for NABET 700M and Section 21 Film and Television Health and Safety Advisory Committee co-chair. So I'm going to hand it over to Jayson first up, and he's going to let us all know how Section 21 came about and what the procedure was for establishing these protocols. Thanks very much, Jayson.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. I guess just very quickly, I can give a bit of an overview in terms of just Section 21 as a body overall. For those that may not be familiar with it, I don't know. So Section 21 is actually a Ministry of Labor endorsed advisory committee. The committee was struck a number of years ago. It's quite accurately Section 21 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act that actually requires or allows for an advisory committee to the Ministry of Labor on certain sectors. So we are one of a handful of sectors here in Ontario that has a Section 21 committee. Effectively what it is it's the Ministry of Labor's recognition that the film and television industry, obviously, as we're all well aware, does not operate like other workplaces. It's sort of whether it comes to health and safety legislation, whether it comes to employment standards legislation, or any of those sorts of things that govern normal workplaces, film and TV is a bit of a square peg round hole type scenario. So the Section 21 committee was developed again a number of years ago to provide that insight and advice to the Ministry of Labor on how we as a sector or as an industry believe that we can achieve what we need to on a day in as safe a manner as possible. So that committee has been in existence, as I say, for a number of years. I've been the labor co-chair of that committee for, I think it's about 8 or 9 years now. Sean Porter, many of you may know from the CMPA, is the management co-chair. On that committee consists of representatives from all the unions and guilds, representatives from obviously the Ministry of Labor itself, from the US studios in terms of they have a number of health and safety reps that sit on the committee, as well as representatives from the CMPA, obviously, producers themselves, and a number of other organizations that feed into that as well. So when obviously COVID-19 broke and the industry shut down effectively mid-March for the most part, not long thereafter, I think all of the union reps and you know, I guess with a bit of an additional kind of capacity as co-chair of the committee, received a number of calls from whether it was from members, you know, in my case, obviously NABET members, whether it was from producers, production managers, just talking about generally how we think when work is able to resume in the province, what we think it may look like and how the world may change. I would say those conversations for me anyways probably started by about mid-April. And I think by mid-April, I mean, Cynthia, obviously you can attest to this and chime in as well, as, you know, I think all of the other labor organization leaders would confirm as well. There was multiple conversations with producers, PMs, and our respective members as to what it's going to look like coming out of this. In an effort to try and kind of focus that discussion, the Section 21 committee developed a COVID-19 subcommittee to specifically look at safe work protocols for when work is able to return in Ontario. The actual subcommittee is, dare I say, larger than the regular committee. There's more representation and more individuals that are part of the subcommittee. I think there was 25 people in total. Again, representatives from all of the unions and guilds. So obviously NABET, obviously DGC Ontario, 873, 667, 411, the CMPA, Film Ontario, Ontario Creates. There's representatives from Whites, from SIM, there was a handful, I think there was 8 altogether of producers, a bit of a cross section between domestic producers and producers, I would say, that skew more service production here in Ontario, as well as representatives from the AMPTP, which I'm sure you know, you're obviously well aware of and have read quite a bit about in the press recently with what they're doing in the US with respect to safe work protocols. Contract Services Administration Trust Fund, which is effectively the health and safety body that oversees health and safety for the US studios in the US. Again, as well as I would say about half a dozen health and safety representatives from individual US studios, Warner Brothers, Sony, Disney, just to name a few. So that committee kind of came together actually very quickly. I would say the 3rd week of April, that committee was struck, or that subcommittee. And we got to work right away. Between May 1st and May 8th, there was 14 different working group meetings. So what we did is the document that you now see as the finalized document, each one of those sections or subsections, a working group was struck to look at the crafting of that document. Each working group consisted of myself as co-chair, Sean Porter, again from CMPA as co-chair, as well as any other union and guild representatives that you know, felt the need or the desire to be a part of the drafting of that guideline, as well as producers and again studio safety reps. Each working group consisted of probably anywhere from, I would say, 6 to about 10 people. And over the course of, like I say, those 8 days, we had 14 working group meetings to come up with an initial draft document. I would say, you know, hats off to everybody involved, not the least of which obviously Cynthia, a huge advocate and a huge crutch for me through this whole process. I was able to rely on her quite a bit, so I thank you for that. Provided invaluable insight on behalf of your membership and just the industry at large with respect to the crafting of that document. So that document, over the course of, I would say, the last 2-3 weeks of May, went through various drafts, and you know, input was sought from you know, and I can just obviously speak to NABET. You know, I put it out to my elected departmental VPs and allowed them to provide input on behalf of the department that they were elected to represent. I know a number of the other unions and guilds did the same as well, as I think the guild did as well. So that document then came to be, was ultimately finalized and approved by both the subcommittee as well as the regular full-time Section 21 committee, and submitted to the Ministry of Labor on June 4th. So really it was about a 4.5 week process in creating this document. Sorry, I don't know if you want to jump in there, or if I'm rambling on, I apologize.
No, I think it's really important because of the material that has been distributed internationally, there's been no shortage of guidelines to read. And I think the guidelines that a lot of you have read have been created in silos, and they've been created by one group of people or a portion of the entertainment community. What is different about these guidelines is that the collaboration and the input has been not only industry-wide, including the labor unions and guilds, but also with the participation of the municipal government and provincial.
Yes.
So other than, I think, BECTU that came out of the United Kingdom, we are the only set of guidelines that have been endorsed with the government support. And that's a huge distinction when you're looking at the validity of how the document is going to be respected. The employers, whether you are working at the high budget and studio-based projects or the lower budget producer who is constantly counting nickels and dollars, they had a voice here. And so this is a document that has been anticipated and has been collaborated with to represent all the work that we do, and no one should be left behind. So it was a regular theme that came up in the questions about how do the lower end producers cope, and the notion is they had a say in this, and because they had a say in it, they must feel that they have the ability to live up to the expectations. The idea is we're not going to be in a two-tiered system. Safety is for everybody and not divided between the haves and the have-nots. So it was a beast of a task, and if any of you have tried to assemble 25 independent thinkers about what return to work looks like in a pandemic, when we've never had a pandemic before, you can imagine. So I'm thrilled. We had a self-imposed date that the committee was targeting of June 1st, and we achieved it. So the ministry also was extremely cooperative in ensuring this was approved, and it was with the current government's pressure that saw it get released so quickly. We've had previous guidelines take more than a year to be approved. So the fact that we could do it in 3 weeks is, it's fantastic. And it tells me that this document is going to be used as a tool for all of us.
That's all right. I think that segues nicely into one of the biggest questions that seems to be percolating in the thought exchange and just sort of in multiple conversations that I've had, which is, you know, I think there's a misconception that these guidelines are law. And maybe we could just talk a little bit about social responsibility and the responsibility of the community and, you know, personal responsibility and what actually is law and what is non-prescriptive.
Sure.
Sure. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, this is where it's awkward. Technology is imperfect. We're going to talk.
Clearly, we didn't rehearse this at all.
you're right. These guidelines are not statutory, and there aren't any guidelines that exist that are statutory. But because our guidelines have existed before the COVID guidance document, these guidelines have been around. The Section 21 guidelines have been around since the late 90s, since 1996, I believe is the exact date that they were created. So it's been a well-respected, utilized tool in the industry. So with the participation of municipal and provincial government, it has elevated the status of this document and will be used. Is it statutory? No, but I think it's going to be respected just because it has the history behind it and the support of government. There was also input by an infectious disease department with the ministry level, as well as a physician. So I think that there's been no stone left unturned. The non-prescriptive nature of these guidelines may be disappointing for some. People might be looking for a little more of the nitty-gritty and a little less should, could, and would. Arguably, I understand that point, but I think because people have anticipated this document, the should, coulds, and woulds are going to be presumably understood as this is the best case scenario and a good starting point for how we all get to work safely. I don't know, would you disagree, Jayson?
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the guidelines themselves are not meant to be prescriptive. They do not say thou shalt not do this and thou shalt or must do this. It's to provide recommendations, and there is a level of, I think, you know, whether it's a studio show, whether it's a location show, there will be different things to take into consideration and how they're going to mitigate this. So I think it takes that into consideration, and of course, as producers to turn their mind to that when they create their individual show-specific policies and procedures. The idea is they will take this, the producers will take this document and create their show-specific policies and procedures from this document. So exactly as Cynthia said, they are just guidelines, but kind of going back to what I said earlier, where the Section 21 committee is an acknowledgement by the Ministry of Labor that we as an industry function a little differently than other industries. And there is an acknowledgement that the industry has come together to create these effectively best practices on how to do the things that we do, whether again, it's the regular guidelines and it's it talks about stunts, or it talks about working with animals, or it talks about, you know, all that sort of stuff. It's a bit of an anomaly, things that we do in this industry, and it's an industry adopted and endorsed, well, industry adopted and Ministry of Labor endorsed best practices. So even if they don't necessarily have the weight of law per se, I do think that if, you know, God forbid something was to happen and the Ministry of Labor did inspect, whether it's one of those things I mentioned or whether it's COVID or whatever the case may be, they will definitely be the best practice and the standard that the production would be held to. So in a de facto kind of way, they do, I think, have more weight and force than, you know, some people believe the paper they're written on.
And I think there was the whole conversation about, we are all in this together. I don't think anybody wants to shut down again once we are up and running. Obviously, we don't know what we're walking into. It's unknown territory, as you've said so succinctly, Cynthia. We've never been through a pandemic before. But I think, you know, everybody is in this together. I've really heard this a number of times at multiple caucus meetings and at other Zooms. And I think it's really important to say that nobody, the producers, the crew, the cast, nobody wants to get sick. Everybody wants to be socially responsible to each other and practice the best protocols so that we can go back to work safely and continue to work. Will there be hiccups? Yes, probably. Let's hope nothing serious. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start with just some of the questions that we've gotten off of the thought exchange. Some of them are very similar, so I'm going to try and sort of put them together and sort of encapsulate overarching themes. But I think one of the themes we could start talking about and maybe get some clarity on right out of the gate is there seems to be a lot of discussion about a reduced workday. And we all know the reasons for this. We all know that obviously it's better for us, for our immune systems, for our overall mental health, for our overall physical health, etc. We at times, you know, work, you know, exceptionally long hours. Was there discussion in the room when we were putting Section 21 together with that? And maybe, Cynthia, you could just talk about why the DGC can't, you know, like change the workday.
The discussion certainly came up significantly. There were a lot of producers that, you know, looked at it as a potential model. However, there's nothing that actually is enforceable to a reduced day. Our collective agreements stipulate that the production department are on 14-hour days and everyone else is on a 12-hour day. It doesn't mean you need to work those 12 or 14. And there will be definitely producers that see merit to a reduction in a workday, but it's not something that we can control as an organization. So for those of you that are expecting a 10-hour day, you might be fortunate enough to work on a show that's doing exactly that. French hours are talked about, and code for French hours are Pacific Northwest. There's lots of different names for them, but essentially it does talk about or refers to a shortened workday. We don't know for sure who's going to take advantage of that kind of system and who isn't. Our collective agreement is what it is, and the other unions and guilds, it's a variance to have the French hours or Pacific Northwestern. So is there a desire from our membership to have a shortened day? For sure there is, but it's nothing that we can guarantee. And if it's an independent choice.
Okay. Jayson, do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there is an element of, and I know it doesn't appease people to hear this, but I think there is going to be an element of we're going to have to wait and see how it unfolds. I think, you know, a lot of this, obviously, we are learning as we go through this. You know, same thing I told my membership on our town hall last week is, you know, we don't have the answers to all of this, and it's going to be something that we're going to have to adapt and learn from as we kind of go down this road and as work starts to resume and people start going back to work.
So let's talk about the fact that these are indeed just guidelines, and hopefully they're guidelines that everybody's going to follow for the obvious reasons that we've already talked about, you know, to have a positive outcome and to get through your production, et cetera, and to prevent sickness from happening and the spread of COVID. But let's talk about, I think everybody's a little bit concerned about who is going to enforce these protocols and what do you do if you're, say, for example, are we talking to productions as they're coming into the guild or into NABET about what their protocols may be? Will those protocols potentially be revealed to people in the job interview? Or, because sometimes that might, you know, prove to be awkward because people are trying to make decisions about which jobs to potentially take and also to get back to work. If those protocols, I mean, let's talk a little bit maybe about how those protocols are going to be, who is making sure, who is policing those protocols? Could we talk a little bit about what your experience has been in that?
Yeah, there, in the guidelines, there's a specific reference to this is the baseline, this is the minimums that need to be achieved, and any company policy and all company policies need to be presented in advance of hiring, so there are no surprises. Nothing is successful without an education component. So what we also want to see is that these guidelines and company policies are being taught is probably not the right word, but certainly being administered so that people know in advance what the expectation is. Nothing can be successful if you don't know the goals that you're supposed to hit. So every company needs two things. Number one, they need to review the Section 21 guidelines, and number two, they need to have their own policy, even if it's only a one-pager, to supplement what already the government has sort of endorsed. So it's twofold. We are asking producers to show us those policies in advance. They've started to come in. When I say they've started, I have two so far, and they will require independent reviewing. hopefully the parent companies, if we look at the sort of the consistent employers, the Entertainment One, the Shaftesbury, they will have one policy that applies to all their productions, because it does get confusing the more policies that are out there. So the education component for sure is number one. And number two, we are asking, I know Jayson and I are in regular contact, so that if he's aware of something or I'm aware of something, we want those policies in advance. And this is the kind of thing that's important to our members. We don't want people signing anything unless we vetted it. There shouldn't be anything hinky out there that's, you know, that someone's asking you to initial, but we want to see it in advance. So if for any reason anyone's out there starting a job, the idea is to call the office, that's me or Victoria, or email us just to say, hey, I've been offered a job. Have these been vetted? Can I sign this effectively? And I'm not, you know, putting myself in any jeopardy. So those are the sort of the three things that need to happen.
And Jayson, maybe you could talk about this. I know there's been conversations about waivers, and maybe we could just have a quick word about waivers. Have you guys seen anybody? Has anybody approached you with waivers? Has there been discussion about waivers? I know what our policy is, but maybe we could reiterate it.
Sure. I mean, at the Section 21 level, there was no discussion. I don't recall anyways, about waivers or anything like that. I can say I've seen one waiver from a production company thus far, where they are asking people to basically waive any and all claims, because they are, notwithstanding all of the COVID mitigation things that they are going to implement on their show, they are asking people to waive any potential claim against the production should, God forbid, something happen and they end up contracting it at work. I mean, I don't know. I think each organization would have to answer that for themselves. I mean, we've dealt with it at NABET, as in you can't, our view is you can't ask people to do that. You can't ask people to waive rights that they have as a condition of employment. If someone ends up contracting it at work, it would be a claim that would be processed through WSIB, and that individual would be able to go on WSIB. So you can't ask them to, and by virtue of WSIB coverage, the production would be prevented from being sued in any case anyways. So that's the only one I've seen thus far. I mean, again, I don't know what the guild's position is with respect to that. I don't want to obviously speak on the guild's behalf with respect to that.
No, I not to go back, but I think your question that you asked, Annie, originally was sort of twofold. It was about the enforcement. Who's enforcing these protocols, right? And that is the biggie. Needless to say, our membership does include production managers, location managers, and production designers who are responsible for a large portion of various departments. So in the guidelines, there's reference to there being someone that's hired whose sole responsibility is to do exactly that. We feel as an organization that our members already have full-time jobs in that they're doing, and this it being an add-on duty is not sufficient. So the hope is that most employers will take that seriously and have looked to hire someone to deal with the logistics and the enforcement. Now, enforcement is a very large word with a lot of letters. And I think the importance of enforcement lies not only with the employer, but with each other. So whether you are a makeup artist with NABET, a location PA with the DGC, or an art department graphics worker, all of us, we all have a responsibility to enforce the policies that we know are in effect. And this is only going to be effective if we all buy into it. There's going to be no opportunity for someone that feels the rules are beyond them. And I think there's a lovely way to do that when members are working together. There's a lot of anxiety about going back to work. When we posed the question to the members, the statistics were sort of not quite 50-50, it was more 60-40. And 40% of you are somewhat ready to go back to work. But those aren't great numbers. So it gives us an idea of the anxiety that exists about doing so. So if we know the document was created collaboratively, and so it has a larger success rate of being workable, the same would be true if there's significant collaboration in enforcing them. again, the success rate goes up. So when someone's mask is being worn, you know, kind of around the neck, there's a lovely way to say, hey, we need to mask up. That's what we're supposed to do. And there should be no shame in that. Realistically, we're in it together. There's no room for we, it's no room for the me, it's the we. That's my new catchphrase.
And I think that there's a discussion about, because I think what people don't want to do is that the location department ends up being, you know, the COVID protocol enforcement people, et cetera. But isn't there something in our contract which states that we can't do jobs that are outside of what is contractually our obligation? So therefore, producers do have to crew up if they need more people to do the work of setting up the protocols?
Yeah, our collective agreement certainly has job definitions that prevent us from doing certain things. One of the biggest concerns is, you know, sanitization and disinfecting. Our location PAs are groomed to be location managers, not to be industrial cleaners. And so where that kind of work is required, it's not in our job description. Cleaning is, which, you know, mild cleaning is significantly different than sanitization and disinfection. That requires a separate skill set altogether. And it's work that we're not interested in doing under our collective agreement. So job descriptions certainly do prevent, but enforcement is effectively going to lie significantly with all the department heads and supervisors to look after their own. And then beneath that, everyone looking out for themselves and their fellow coworkers. So it's really no one person. We know safety is always the employer's job, but effectively it's all of our responsibility as well. And that exists in the Occupational Health and Safety Act as well. This shouldn't be news to anybody.
So let's talk a little bit about if there is a situation. So we've got a couple of questions here. And one is, if someone is diagnosed with COVID-19, does the production stop in order to determine the level of the outbreak? And when might production resume again after an outbreak?
Yeah, this is the ugly question and the elephant in every room. Is it possible that it would shut down the show? Yes. This is where contact tracing and the pod system becomes very important. So if, as an example, somebody in the construction department fell sick, you would be able to potentially track who was in contact with that person. It might be that the construction and paint department has to shut down, but if there was limited contact with other departments, it wouldn't necessarily. So this is sort of a dangerous question. I think there's a lot of ifs around that, but technically it is very possible, and it is going to rely on the producer to make that decision. It's not going to rely on us. If we felt the producer was taking a reckless approach and saying, no, we're not shutting down the show, then that's where the unions and guilds would have a place. And the worker themselves would have the ability under the work refusal to examine the facts and say, this is high risk, the show should shut down. I think for the first time ever, for those of you who may have heard this already on some of the caucus calls that you've been on, producers and the labor unions have not always been perfectly aligned because there's financial implications of our relationship. It has been adversarial at times. But now more so than ever, the producer is invested in your health like no other time ever, because you are effectively their most important asset, and your health is part of that asset. So I don't think we're going to see any sort of reckless behavior or abandonment of what makes sense. They are very concerned about their product, and because you are the creator of that product, your health and safety is paramount. It's the only thing they're talking about.
Jayson, do you have anything you want to add from your perspective on that? I think this leads, if not, this leads into, there's a couple of questions about sick days, and maybe we can get some clarity on this because, you know, one of the questions was, will there be an amendment to the contract to allow for additional paid 6 days in order to dissuade sick people from coming into the office or on set? What happens if I get sick? Do I lose my job? Can we just talk a little bit about where the sick day rules actually lie? Because I believe it's provincial, correct? Currently?
No, it is, in our agreement, we have, as you know, there's the Ontario agreement, then there's the core agreement, and in the core agreement, it's attached to the provincial jurisdiction. So when the Conservatives came into power, the 2 sick days were reduced to 1. So right now, there's only 1 sick day. And I know for those of you that are at home hearing this, it's very disheartening to hear, because what we really need is an improvement at that level. It's ridiculous to think that where you have 1 sick day, it has always discouraged people from calling in sick because they know they're not going to get paid, especially when your bank accounts are looking rather slim. This is going to be a complete shift in the culture in our industry. If there's one thing that has taught us and has been where we need to see improvements, I guess, is in our industry and in the culture generally. We've known that people have looked at those that don't come to work because they are ill as being weak or not part of the team, and the expectation is that, unless you're dead, you have to come to work. That's no longer going to be acceptable, and we're hoping that employers in their independent policies will make some sort of provision to discourage that behavior. So in the guidelines, there's a self-assessment tool, which I'm sure most people have already seen, to evaluate their own health on an ongoing basis. And if you do that self-assessment and you come up with a potential that scratchy throat and the loss of your sense of smell is an indication there could be a problem. Not there would be, but there could be. But by taking that as self-assessment, you know you should stay away from work. You shouldn't report to work. But if you're not getting paid, the culture's always dictated, go anyway. And so these independent policies, I'm hoping they make reference to that. But currently, under the Ontario law, and our agreement doesn't make any additional provisions for it, it would be one sick day. And if you can prove that if you do get sick, that you got COVID in the workplace, then WSIB is also an option. Now, we've not tested it. I don't know how easy or complicated it's going to be to go down that road, but those will be our 2 options that we have, that our members have available to them should the disaster strike.
I'm just wondering, is there been any discussion in regards to having obviously this whole COVID situation will affect daily hires, and also this could, lead into the sick days. If someone is off work, do they have protocols in place for backup crews to come in and take over for those people? Is there been any discussion in regards to that? Sort of like thinking ahead.
Jayson, do you want to take that one? Because you have a lot of dailies in your membership.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I mean, it's tough to say. We're going to kind of have to see as we go down the road on this. I think in certain departments that I represent, yeah, there might be a reduction in the number of dailies. By the same token, there may well be an increase in the number of full-time positions that will be realized on production. I mean, I understand production's desire to limit dailies and have, different people coming and going every day. So how do you do that? Well, you potentially hire them full-time so that you have Jayson Mosek coming for the next 5 weeks, 5 days a week. To take that kind of potential element of uncertainty out of the equation. I also think, again, I mean, we'll see how it plays out, but I think in terms of the pod system that, Cynthia had mentioned earlier on, I think, if a production is set up with this pod mentality where certain people from various pods will never interact, and certain people will now not be able to go to certain places. If I'm part of the prep crew, I can now not go to set. I can now not mix and mingle with the set crew. How does that work? Again, for NABET, certain departments that I represent, like props and whatnot, maybe that then means there actually needs to be additional bodies. Because that kind of floater, if you will, position that would always be going, but now can't. They can't. So, but I don't know. I mean, there's a bit of a, again, a wait and see approach on that. I don't want to obviously speak for the guild in terms of what it means for their members, but I do think there's going to be a wait and see approach.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, Annie, I think that Jayson's absolutely right. There might be a contraction in some departments and an expansion in others, just to limit the comings and goings of the dailies. Producers might very well say, hey, a five-man team is bigger than I anticipated, but I'd rather be consistent with my five-man team than have a three-man team with foreign bodies coming in and out. So that's a difficult one to answer. I think that for our membership, there's probably going to be more studio work than there is location work, because you can actually limit a significant amount of the risks when you're in a studio. So that may have impact on the contraction of those departments in locations if they are mostly in studio. But then again, there's going to be significant amount more garbage, and there's more tables and chairs because people are separated. So it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint. It's going to come down to the elements of the various shows. But I think either is possible, which is probably not the answer everyone's hoping for. But some of these questions are hard because they are difficult.
Yeah.
And I think too, just inherently, as more shows get off the ground and kind of get started, I think, as they kind of start to get their sea legs under them, they will start out in studio, which inherently, means somewhat smaller crew, minimize the number of dailies. As restrictions are lifted, and again, people start to get their sea legs, a little more comfortable with the process and the protocols, they will then get a little bit bigger and start going out. Now it means, more for locations, and for me, more for transport and stuff like that. And get bigger and kind of do more and go further out. So I think there'll be that natural kind of growth progression that we'll see over the coming, weeks and months.
So I think there's a couple of things here I wanted to touch base on, and that is obviously we are a province which has a huge amount of service production, and it's a part of our makeup of our ongoing productions. We do have our own, Ontario-based producers that are local, et cetera. But what I know currently, they've just extended, I believe, the travel ban until July 31st, as of this morning, I believe. And there's obviously the 2-week quarantine issue. And a lot of times, keys in departments, or a director, or a production designer, or a producer, et cetera, are obviously foreign bodies in our landscape. And maybe, how there's in previous times, there's been a lot of travel back and forth. How are we going to approach that? And I know some people said, will there be any sort of waiver room on that 14-day quarantine? What are our thoughts on that from the Directors Guild and from NABET?
Well, the travel ban is certainly a hiccup. However, it also can be advantageous. I'm hoping that this creates an opportunity where jobs for directors in particular have been, more difficult to get on the service work. But we are saying, hey, listen, don't worry about that LA director and the 14-day quarantine. We have 400 here that don't need to quarantine who are fabulous. So it's very possible the longer that the travel restrictions, because of the situation in the US, I hate to ever say that someone's, bad situation benefits another, but that is one possible outcome that could happen. The quarantine, there's no wavering, any guidelines aside, there's no wavering on whatever laws, but not laws, but whatever regulations the government puts out. So right now, even though travel restriction is not till the end of July, if you have a work permit and you are in the US, you can still come with a bona fide job offer, but the 14-day quarantine is a must. And the same is true for our members who might be getting job offers elsewhere in the country. Different provinces have different regulations. So I know Manitoba, as an example, they're waiving theirs, which is a bit shocking. But if you came from Ontario, which, you know, let's face it, our numbers are way more, well, less impressive than they are in Manitoba, to waive that 14 days seems a little bit, I don't know, risky. But that's the Manitoba rules. We don't have the same. So it's hard to say, but the quarantine is outside of all of our purview. It is definitely a provincial and federal issue. So we can't waive anything. No variances on that sort of stuff.
Right. Here's a question I've got is, if, for example, you were on a production, you were working and you got some symptoms, but it was deemed, you know, it could be deemed that it wasn't COVID, but they ask you to quarantine regardless. Do you have a place to come back to on that production? Can you lose your job in that situation? How does that work with the Directors Guild?
So you wouldn't lose your job. You are protected two ways, under the collective agreement and under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. If you were sent home that day because you have symptoms that could be potentially COVID, obviously you're paid for the day because you've already been at work. You might need an additional day off to be tested or to see a healthcare professional to deem you safe to return to work. And once those two things have been achieved, then you go back to work. If you did have COVID and you can't resume work for, let's say, 1 week, 2 weeks, I think it depends on what kind of case you have, then the idea is the job would be there available to you when you are deemed safe to return to work. And only a healthcare professional can determine that you're safe to return to work. It's not going to be an arbitrary department head or producer that makes that decision. It would be a healthcare professional.
And if, for example, I've just got a question here, if the unlikely event that somebody does get COVID in the middle of a production and they're working through the Directors Guild on a personal service corporation, is there any liability issues there, or does that all lie with the employer? You know, if you've been deemed to have COVID and say you are the person that they are indeed contact tracing, is there any liability there?
In our collective agreement, sorry to cut you off, my apologies. No, in our agreement, in our agreement, there's an indemnification clause. None of us are liable for anything. And if you're incorporated or you work as an employee, your status with us is no different. The only difference would be under WSIB, what you'd be entitled to. I think people are often surprised when they work as loan-outs if they were fortunate enough to make, you know, as an example, $100,000 a year, but they only report to CRA $30,000. Their WSIB payments are based on the $30,000 that they made personally, not what the corporation earned. That would be the only difference.
I think one of the bigger questions here is about department specificity. So we have a number of questions that have come in regards to the art department because of the, I think of the, you know, the breadth of who they interact with, and their department has very specific issues. Is there anything you could talk to in regards to protocols or maybe an approach that they could take that would help them in their, you know, in their specificity of interaction with different departments?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, everybody wants to know how it impacts them, and I think that's human nature. So if I'm in the art department and I'm looking at the guidance document, I think, oh, where do I fit in? Well, I'm lumped into with the office, and that might be not a great thing to hear. But realistically, because these guidelines are not prescriptive, and we have shows who have an art department of 1, and we have other productions that have an art department of 20. So realistically, if you are physically working in an office, and that's the same is true for post-production, there are many picture editors that work not at a facility, but they work in a production office, or they work in their homes. The guidance document had to reflect all those variations. So for people in the art department, I think, you know, one of the, and all people in the office, whether it's in post-production, whether it's in prep for the ADs and location and the production manager in particular, accounting as well, is about space. And we know studio space is always, studio and office space has always been a big challenge for us when we get busy. And the notion is, hey, look, we have a 10 by 12 room. How many people can we ram in there to get the job done? That's no longer going to be an acceptable philosophy. So for those of you that are approached and are asked to, you know, put your desk and chair in a room and share with people where distance is not possible, that's a no-go anymore, right? We know that things that have been acceptable in the past are not going to be acceptable now. So the office guidelines don't generate specifics for accounting, post, and art, but it does talk about your individual space, and that's where the commonalities and the overarching themes exist. So the non-prescriptive nature, for those of you that are in accounting, art, and post, we could have guidelines for every specific department, but it didn't make sense given the variables that from a production by production basis.
Jayson, I had a question from someone who was asked whether or not the Section 21 committee reached out to unrelated industries that have been continuously working through COVID to get any feedback. Was that something that the Section 21 committee did or think about doing maybe in the future?
I think it's during the actual process. No, I mean, it was strictly limited to those in the industry. And then as Cynthia mentioned off the top, you know, looking at what other jurisdictions had released with respect to some of their protocols and whatnot. I do think, you know, on a go forward basis, yeah, there is the potential. I mean, right off the top, it does talk about the fact that this is obviously a living document and that the committee, you know, will be coming together in the coming weeks and months to look at potentially modifying this document as things in the province change, as directive from public health change over the course of the weeks and months. So at that opportunity, potentially, I'm assuming, you know, public health will be making decisions, taking that into account as well, as to what they're seeing, you know, whether it's, you know, grocery stores and whatnot that have been open through all of this time, and how that factors into the directives that they are also giving as well.
So we're getting a lot of questions about testing. So is it mandatory, et cetera? I know it's outlined in the Section 21 guidelines, and maybe people haven't read the guidelines as of yet, but maybe we could just talk about what the guidelines say about testing and where there's been discussion about it and what it might mean moving forward.
Yeah, that's another big question that is a complicated one. Realistically, because the Safe Way Forward document out of Hollywood came out, and they've talked about mandatory testing, and not just mandatory testing, but the frequency being as significant as 3 times a week. Our guidance document does not reflect that kind of testing, but knowing we have a relationship with our American partners, we've now sent this to legal. This is a complicated question because of the human rights component, and there are different schools of thought. Some people say, test away, everyone should be tested. Test, 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 let's do it. And others say, well, let's do testing for the sake of information and protecting one another, not for the sake of testing. Like literally, I heard someone from one of our partners yesterday on a call saying that the frequency of testing could potentially alleviate the 14-day quarantine. Because if you're tested 3 times a week, well, So to me, that's a draconian way of thinking. That 14-day quarantine is super important for all the obvious reasons. The mandatory testing here, I think there's two schools of thought. One is it might be a very healthy approach to giving people comfort in knowing their coworkers are safe to come to work. But realistically, if you're taking the TTC home and then happen to be enjoying a beverage on a patio on your downtime, that test is no longer valid. It has a very short lifespan. So for labor organizations, anything that is, any adverb like mandatory, I think that's an adverb. Anyway, the wordsmiths can correct me later, but it is something that we have to take sort of seriously. I know that in early discussions, the law firms were talking about, we've never had a pandemic before. So human rights factors are going to be significantly loosened, because this is not like taking a urine test to see if you're using illicit drugs on your private time. This is taking a test to ensure everyone's safety. It might also be a component that the producer requires. Insurance is a real big hot point discussion right now, and it might bring completion guarantors some satisfaction knowing the crew's been tested. So this is a real hot button topic, and I hate to be vague and inconsistent in the response, but there's too many what ifs and too many surrounding factors. So we have engaged lawyers looking at a legal opinion on where we should stand on this topic. So for now, I would say we would definitely consider it, but I don't know about the frequency or the word mandatory.
Right, and obviously because everybody is in their own bubble, you know, you could be tested on Monday, go home, your significant other could have been out in the workforce, come home, your child could potentially have been at school, if you know what I mean, in that bubble, and you're all mixing it up again, and then you come in the next day and you could have picked something up from someone else. So that repeated testing, you know, is up for discussion about its efficacy in regards to all of that. So,
well, I mean, that's exactly the point. And these tests are not like a blood test, right? It's quite invasive. And I haven't had one myself, but you know, some people probably have a significant adverse reaction to it. So there's a lot to consider here. It's a work in progress. That's how we probably should best identify that one.
So I'm going to just ask a question for the directors in the room, because we've gotten a couple of questions from the directors. We have different challenges based on an expectation of delivering the same kind of content with new protocols, with many times unextended schedules due to budget restrictions, et cetera, because it's not like many, you know, everybody is giving the 20 or 30% more money that they're going to need to achieve this. And once again, we're going into the unknown, and we don't know how long things are going to take, and we don't know what the potting and the bubbling and all that sort of stuff is going to provide in regards to how many hours out of the day that is going to take away from the directors. But I think also producers are looking at how are they going to handle if a director, you know, especially when you're getting into episodic and you might only be there for 6 to 7 days, how are they going to handle if a director gets sick or starts to feel ill and wants, you know, has to leave the set and go and quarantine themselves? How does that work? Do they have to hire a new director at a different contract, or does somebody come? How does that all work out?
It's very different when we talk about a crew person getting COVID-19. Under the directors or a principal leading actor, it would fall under the force majeure language of our agreement. So force majeure looks very different from each labor organization. We all have different force majeure language. Under our agreement, force majeure means that everyone can go home and the producer has until the end of that working week to come up with another plan. What does that other plan look like? If it means that the same crew can go back to work on Monday and a director is replaced, that's possible. The replacement language for directors is also complicated because the number one thing, it's the second clause in the director's schedule, there shall be one director. So again, this is a complicated situation. If there was a suspension of time, that's what the producer has. He or the producer has until the end of the first week to contemplate their next move. And what their next move would mean, I assume, would be to ask for a replacement director. And we'd have to determine as a variance in our contract if we would allow that or not. If they decided the director only needed another week to get well, it then would mean our crew hasn't had sufficient notice and they would be entitled to the 1 week layoff language in our agreement for the next week. So the what ifs are a little bit dangerous because it depends on who's actually getting sick and whose agreement you're working under. But that would be the right answer for us. If a director got sick due to COVID or any other serious illness, it hits force majeure.
Okay. So if you, for example, are asked to stay at home for 2 weeks, we have a question here that says, can the production still request you to work? That mostly goes to people in management positions like a location manager. Can they order you to continue working from home? So if, for example, once again, you've got some sort of symptoms and they ask you to quarantine yourself at home for 2 weeks, can they indeed, if you were, say, a production designer or, you know, the head of the accounting department or in post, can they ask you to remote work during that time?
Yes, they can. If they are paying you, they can ask you to work. What they can't do, if I use a ridiculous example, if you're a picture editor, they can't ask you to come to work and perform the duties of a production coordinator. But if you are being paid and can work remotely, yes, the expectation is you absolutely must. And if you choose not to, you're effectively quitting.
So even if you're ill, so even if you have symptoms.
Oh, sorry, I missed, yeah, my apologies. I didn't hear that part. No, so if you're ill, that comes down to the sick day portion, right? You would be allowed the one sick day or be entitled to WSIB if you can prove you got sick at work, and that's all you'd be entitled to. No one can force you to work when you're sick. You have to be well. Is that the question?
Well, I think it's more like if you were to get symptoms and, you know, potentially they are the symptoms that could be flu, but it could also be COVID, as we well know, or a common cold. There's very similarities there. I think this person was asking if you were asked to go home for 2 weeks in self-quarantine and you're at home, can they ask you to work during those 2 weeks?
Well, this is like, the quarantine thing is a really interesting question because we have said if the producer is dictating any movements of yours, you're paid. So if you've been sent home because you have the sniffles and it can't be identified that you have allergies or you have COVID and you're well enough to work, you're on payroll, the expectation is you can achieve something. Similar to the Manitoba example I gave, if I'm a production accountant and I get offered a job in Manitoba and there's a 2 week quarantine, I'm being paid. I'm on distant location. I have to be paid for that 2 week period, but I certainly can achieve a lot of work remotely. I might not be able to do the job in as well as if I was physically in the office, but the one thing that you know, no one likes to be wrong, but I'm actually happy to say I'm happy to have been wrong about a lot of these things. Where our industry has felt we've been unable to work remotely, it appears as though we can. DGC offices have been open during this entire time and we're working remotely. A lot of our post-production members were able to, with technology, take the work that they were doing at a facility and work remotely. And this is somewhat scary for a labor organization, because as soon as you can work remotely, it opens up different kinds of problems. But the upside is, if we know we can work remotely, it mitigates so much of the dangerous exposure. So those who are hearing this and who are supervisors and department heads, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, but if you can figure out a way to manage your department and have a portion of you work remotely, and it's possible, it appears as though in some cases it is, that's an effective way of moving forward.
I think there's a lot of concern around reporting. There seems to be quite a few questions about reporting. And obviously, you know, I think we've been through this, you know, before with the other movements, the Me Too movement, et cetera, where, you know, sometimes you feel uncomfortable reporting to the person above you or reporting to your boss, that sort of thing. I think everybody's looking for protocols for this. If they don't feel comfortable reporting to their, their superior, let's call it that, or if that superior is not following guidelines, what should they do?
Jayson, do you want to take this one?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, there's, you know, obviously, as we talked about earlier on, there's going to be this COVID supervisor, coordinator, whatever the position is going to be, who is going to be responsible for overseeing the policies and procedures in the workplace. So I think if there's a concern that a certain department or individuals within a department are not following the procedures, it probably should be brought up with that individual first. I mean, I guess the Ministry of Labor is always an option. I mean, you know, you always have that available to you as a worker here in Ontario to contact the Ministry of Labor. You know, obviously I don't want to, again, speak for the Guild, but I suspect, you know, calling the union, having them intervene on your behalf is an option that's available to you.
And if a crew member refuses, if one of our crew members refuses to follow the guidelines put in place by the producers, is that grounds for dismissal and or a grievance by another member?
I'll let Cynthia take that.
Yeah, thank you, Jayson. Thank you very much. I'm getting all the hard ones. Listen, you know what? Because the effectiveness of keeping each other healthy, and I say each other, it doesn't matter what labor organization you're a member of. If you decide to not follow a company's policy, we will take the position that it's grounds for dismissal. We have no other choice. The idea is for blatant disrespect for a policy. I don't mean a casual, you know, if I go back to the mask example and, you know, you're wearing it above your head because you were, you know, hot or you needed a breath and you got too close to a coworker, that's not a flagrant disrespect.
Yeah.
But if there are people that are somewhat renegades and find a mask uncomfortable and at every opportunity are not wearing it, and after a warning or two, it would be cause for dismissal. And when it's cause, there's no entitlement to any kind of financial compensation. So I think all the labor organizations are going to support each other with a similar view. So it is a good thing to say out loud, as much as it is a hard thing to do. Is everyone be aware? We're taking this seriously, and I almost kind of think there should be a different way of phrasing that question. So rather than as a labor organization having to defend the person that felt they were above the rules, it would be the rest of the membership that is saying, I'm doing it, so why, you know, you deserve to be let go, because realistically the rest of us are doing the best we can. So I think so much of this COVID stuff is the way it's phrased and the positioning of the various labor organizations and fellow members, if you know what I mean.
Jayson, maybe you can talk to this. There's been a couple of questions in regards to studios. A lot of us, you know, are working on shows that have standing sets on studios. A lot of us are inside the studios for very long periods of time, sometimes months of time. And I'm wondering, was there ever, and I know the studio owners, many of them, I believe, some of them were in the Section 21 committee. committees. And I'm wondering if there was discussion about upgrades in regards to ventilation, in regards to putting in, hands-free sinks, et cetera, all those sorts of protocols. Was there, maybe you could talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely was conversations with a number of the studio owners as part of the process. I do know that a number of them are in the process, particularly over the last week or so, of doing those exact upgrades to their facilities. If you haven't seen it, and not to, play any favorites or, speak on any in favor of any one studio, if you haven't seen it, there is actually an excellent video floating around from CineSpace, where it's about a 3-minute video on YouTube where they have what they've put together that articulates and outlines all of the measures that they've put in place, particularly at 777 Kipling, which is fantastic. I know a number of the other studios are looking at doing similar sorts of things. I know some of the smaller studios or facilities that are typically used as studios are doing those same sorts of things as well, putting in, touchless faucets in the washrooms and automatic doors and paper towel dispensers and just even stuff like that. I know they are undertaking those measures, yeah.
So I think we should talk about the really big, important conversation, which is food. We're all used to a certain sort of mode of, shall we say, grazing and, trays of food and all those sorts of things. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the discussion and the guidelines around Section 21. And I think there's a lot of anxiety about this. Seems to have a lot of questions about how are we going to do a communal kitchen in prep? How are we going to, what are the protocols? How are there, and the guidelines? How are we going to cater? How are we going to eat, etc.? Have there been talks about rolling lunches, or, maybe we could just talk a little bit about catering and craft?
Yeah, everyone's trying to get creative about how to solve this. Needless to say, when you're at work for 10 hours or more, food is inevitable. So craft service is, in our agreement, believe it or not, the only thing we have for craft service is water, coffee, tea, and light snacks when provided to other labor organizations. So the minimums of our contract, it's not because producers want to seem cruel and unkind, but it's about mitigating any kind of exposure. So the craft service and food was a really big topic, and it is definitely going to look different. It is one of the biggest, not one of the biggest, everything is big, I shouldn't make it sound, but it is vital. So the craft service truck, one of the most common scenarios is that there will be no longer foot traffic on and off the craft service truck. It will be similar to a window system, where you would say to someone, I'd like a coffee, please, and you'd get handed the coffee, and it might even be, I'd like 2 creams, 2 sugars, or they're going to be individual packets that you empty into your coffee. So self-serve is no longer a thing. That communal bowl of chips and even a fruit bowl will be off the table. And my guess is producers are going to contribute craft service to what the bare minimum of what the collective agreement requires, just because it helps them so much. The lunch thing is different. There's been a whole host of different ideas. The buffet is certainly, gone are the buffets. The buffet may still exist, but it's going to look different. There would be servers, there would be plexiglass, those sorts of things. Some shows have talked about letting people go out at lunch and providing the lunch money and everyone go and get their own lunch. Other producers have said that's the craziest thing I've ever heard of, because now you have 65 people you've just created mandatory testing and they're all going out for lunch, and exposure to the community at large. So there is not one particular solution on this topic, but lunch is going to look significantly different. The one thing we do know is that when you're sitting down for a meal, you're not going to be sitting at a picnic table with 6 people. 3 little bums on one side and 3 little bums on the other fit very nicely, but no way are you distancing. So the lunchrooms will need to be bigger, Or the other thing that has been suggested is the French hours, so that actually there's always a rolling meal, and so it prevents the overcrowding in the lunchrooms. The other one is to stagger lunch hours. So some parts of the crew where they can eat earlier. So as you can tell, depending on the crew, depending if you're on location, depending if you're in the studio, the lunch situation is definitely going to be a moving target. And I think it's important to know, producers haven't done this before either. They're just like us. They're experiencing it for the first time. So there's going to be probably changes. They're going to try something week one and determine, okay, that wasn't perfect. We can do better. And, you know, realistically, this is what we do as a film community. We think great on our feet. We're problem solvers, we're collaborators, and like never before, those are skills that are going to see you succeed. If there's anyone out there listening who thinks they're going to go to work and it's going to look exactly the way it did in February, it's not good for you. We are going to have to be very flexible in the way we approach our jobs.
Yeah, and I think there's also too, there's the other extensions, like I think there's some questions here in regards to like LSP companies, you know, cash extras participating. We have those people that are, you know, dare I call them transient, but they are there and then they're gone and they're somewhere else and they're on another set the next night, etc. You know, might there be discussions in regards to trying to, once again, I think about this when, you know, I used to be an AD and you would be constantly trying to find dailies and, you know, there'd be that, you know, that epic search for dailies. Maybe there'll be more thought put into establishing those days that we're going to need people and hiring the same people and having them go through the protocols and be on that show for the duration of that show, as opposed to like going willy-nilly around town.
No, I think exactly that. The location support personnel is a perfect example where those, you know, our jobs are precarious, but that role is even more precarious. So it might be very beneficial for a producer to say, hey, I want these 10 location support personnel booked every single day, and they're going to be part of the overall team. Someday they may have lots to do, and other days they might not have enough. But it is about establishing your network of consistent workers. Background is a whole other challenge. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but realistically, the writers are supposed to be in the writers' rooms right now, finding ways to limit any kind of crowd scene, because and budgets being bumped up for visual effects, because you can't have a crowd, you know, rushing towards an unprotected, unmasked actor. It's just not going to fly. So those are some of the bigger challenges. And as you pointed out, as a director, creatively interesting. How do you make it look great with 5 people when you really wish you had 50?
Welcome to Canadian film.
I think that's just it. I mean, sorry, just to interrupt there. I mean, I think Cynthia's hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think the creative is going to take a huge hit. You're right, whether it's background, whether it's, you know, scenes with intimacy or, you know, any sort of kissing or anything, you know, bar fight or whatever, people getting thrown into each other, like that's just not going to happen now. Or you're going to have to be very creative in how you do that. And, you know, yes, it is obviously the film industry. So, you know, we cheat and create things and make them look a certain way, but I think it's going to be a lot more of that. I think, you know, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I apologize. Yes. Anyways, the creative is going to take a huge hit.
Yeah. And I think the big challenge there is there's a lot of creative in the pipeline that was already developed pre-COVID, obviously. And so, you know, it's the easiest thing to get back into the pipeline rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and go all Bergman, as I like to say, for the next little while. And, you know, we are getting scripts. I've read some, you know what I mean, that are obviously written pre-COVID, that have huge crowd scenes, that have interactive, you know, elements to them. And there are discussions happening there. I think Warren Carr was speaking at our AGM, our national DGC AGM that was on last Saturday. And he spoke that even he's having, you know, the difficult conversations with Netflix, you know, going back to them and saying, this is great, but we can't do this anymore. So what are we going to do? So I think I'm hoping for a top-down approach to that creative solution making. I don't know if we're going to see it right away, and I think the directors are going to be very challenged by that. I think we have to be very vocal about, coming up with solutions and be very creative within this new box that we're being handed. I think there was just a quick question here. Somebody mentioned in the guidelines, it does talk about bringing your own food or bringing your own lunch. And I guess there was just a conversation there about would crew members potentially be compensated if indeed that was the case, or if production encouraged people to bring their own lunch.
Yeah, in our agreement, if the producer provides it, then they're not obligated to compensate you. But it might be one of the solutions for those that are working more regular hours, like in post-production, art, or accounting. A producer might say, if you would like to bring in your own lunch, that's fine. And then the lunch money would be provided. So this is where it's going to be a varied solution on varied shows. The idea of bringing your own lunch to work, the other problem is the communal kitchen. So it solves one problem, but it creates another. And so it really depends on what the facilities are like in the studio that you're in.
And I think this could sort of feed into that conversation about working from home. And I think we're all very interested in seeing how, certain departments could potentially manage to maybe have half of their team working from home and have half the team in the office. And I'm wondering, is there been any discussion about the cost of working from home? Will there be new kit fees introduced for members that are, because once again, you're upping your hydro bill, you're paying for your internet. Will there be, has there been discussion with the producers during all of this to sort of be mindful of new kit fees that may come down the pipe?
No, kit fees haven't come up, but I think it's a normal expectation. If you're reducing the blueprint of a production office and therefore making it, more affordable, the producer knows there's associated costs. So if we talk about loan outs have always had the ability to utilize the home office and hydro, cell phone, and those types of things to reduce their taxable income. The employee has the ability to put it on a T2200. So this is where administratively your jobs take on a little bit of a different role. You do need to keep really good receipts for that sort of stuff. And if the employer is compensating you for them, then a T2200 is no longer valid because you can't get the money and then claim it as well. So these are some, some small, minute differences in the way you work, but realistically, if you are supplying your computer, it's a negotiation tactic. It doesn't, it sort of seems obvious if someone's working from home, you now have an expectation to be compensated for those additional costs that you're taking on. And I think producers are prepared for it. It's just the reimbursement. How high are people expecting and what can be tolerated?
So I think we've hit a lot of the subject matters that our questions came in. I'd like to sort of talk about, I think there's some really great basic rules. And I know that a lot of people feel that these guidelines perhaps aren't stringent enough. I think there's a general concern that they're not rules as opposed to guidelines. And I think part of that is from the anxiety that we're all feeling about this world that we don't know what it's going to be like. And obviously many people have been touched with family members or friends or have known somebody that has had COVID, or maybe, God forbid, they've lost somebody to COVID. And I think there is a lot of anxiety. I know there's also a lot, I'm talking to a lot of actors, and there's a lot of anxiety there to go back to work and to be expected to feel confident and comfortable enough in that new environment to deliver, as for directors. And I just wanted to touch a little bit on post, because we've had a few questions about post, and post can be a very intimate sort of, experience. You're in a room, there's, a couple of people for a long period of time. Has there been any sort of specific discussion? I'm sure that you post houses were in on the Section 21 committee, and thoughts on that. I know there's a lot of new technologies that have been tested during COVID, because post was one of the first things to go back. Maybe Jayson, you could talk a little bit about that, and Cynthia sort of talk about working remotely and how that's going to play with directors and editors in post and that sort of thing.
Well, I'm happy to talk about the post-production part, because that was one of the guidelines that I sat in on, because so much of our membership lives in those particular caucuses. I have to say it was the one thing that producers reacted to very quickly, along with our members, and saying, hey, I've got the technology, just give me the chance to prove it so. And so without missing much of a beat, even though there's been zero production, a lot of post-productions continue to happen. So either facilities or producers were able to get gear into people's homes, or people already had gear that they were now able to rent back to the employer, and post-production resumed. As you know, now with the subscription video on demand product out there, all these shows want to release as a package. It's not like you can be behind and release one episode at a time. They want to release all 10 or all 13 episodes. So our post members, although they were impacted, they had a better success rate at remaining employed because of the work at home. The facilities did sit on Section 21 because, of course, they too are worried about what this looks like. Some of these mixing sessions is with a lot of people. ADR can be with a lot of people. And realistically now, it's not going to be with a lot of people unless they have a really big mixing stage. So realistically, those are sort of changes that producers, I mean, I know of one show, the lead actress was doing ADR from her bedroom closet while her 3-year-old was, banging on the door saying, let me in, let me in. So there's so many different ways work can actually be achieved, but post-production, where we run into the bigger challenges with the American producers wanting to have their creative control, right? And the staring over the shoulder, that's a bigger deal. So that kind of relationship would no longer be allowed under current rules. So whether it's done with file sharing, whether it's done with laptops that can be, transferred, that sort of stuff, but there will no longer be the ability to have a director sit side by side with a picture editor. Technology is going to have to come into effect, which is always a shame because it impacts the whole creative process and the way the job gets done. But I don't think there's a department out there that's not going to be impacted by this, and that's one of the downsides. So post-production was a big topic, and the facilities did participate in these guidelines for those very reasons. They don't want their business model impacted. And believe it or not, a lot of the shows that we sign come here just for post. We have an international reputation for being great at this, whether it's picture or sound or both. So this is part of the equation that requires, again, creative problem solvers and members that can work effectively on their own. And that's the irony about this business, right? We're creative animals and we do so well when we're collaborating and doing it side by side. Now we're going to be expecting the same, but doing it without being side by side. So post, I think, is a little bit easier. And if there's people out there that are on this, this call, stepping on some toes, but I think it was easier.
I know that April Mullen had just posted that she had to post her whole movie that they shot just in the desert before COVID. They had to do it remotely. And, she was deeply concerned by that, but she said actually Images and Sound had 2 different rooms synced so that the mixers could be in different rooms, but they could be working together in tandem. And then she was live remotely, and there's a bunch of new technologies, even for color correction. So you're actually in the room, but you're remote, but you're in the room with they send you a calibrated screen, and you're working with the with the color correction with the colorist. And also many of my friends are now doing their ADR remotely at home and their voiceovers at home. They've been sent the equipment and the gear, and we're able to do it remotely. You know, probably not ideal at the end, but, you know, we are creative people and we're brilliant at what we do. So we're going to adapt and make it so.
Well, I think that's an important thing, though. None of this is ideal, and we're looking at it as temporary, right? I think it's the only way. Let's be hopeful. Let's look at this as, hey, we've been thrown a challenge. It's not particularly pleasant. It has a whole bunch of downsides, but let's look at it as a temporary situation, and we come out the other side. We just don't know when, and that's the hardest thing to accept. Whenever we're given a challenge, you always want to know how long the pain is going to last. When you're in a cast, you're told 6 to 8 weeks. You know it's going to be over week 8. We don't have the benefit, you know, that's on what we've been thrown right now. So it is important, people, for, you know, all our members who are out there who are looking this at the long term. Let's not think that way. Let's think positively, that this is a temporary way that we do business, and with any luck, it will be short-lived.
Before I do, we're going to wrap it up because we're at the end of it. And I just want, before I do the housekeeping and wrap it up, Jayson, would you have any final words that you'd like to say? Anything that we didn't touch on that you think our members should know about Section 21?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, you know, the notion has been touched on. I think is a common theme throughout this has been, you know, it's gonna take a village to kind of get us back to work, and it's going to take a lot of cooperation between, you know, all unions and guilds and crew members and departments and whatnot. Not to say that always hasn't been there already, but obviously it's going to take on an added level. And I think, you know, the expectation is that that is going to be there. And like Cynthia said, I mean, it's a bit of, yes, it's a learning curve, and it's also something that we hope is just short term, and that, you know, we will come out of this. I mean, I think, you know, people are concerned about going back to work and potential second waves and all that sort of stuff. There is concerns about that. And I think it's all what we can do collectively to mitigate as best we can when we do go to work, that from happening on any one show.
Well, listen, everybody, that is our time. I'm just going to go through a couple of things. I'd like to thank Jayson for your incredible commitment to this work and for co-chairing this committee. And and our members and all of our staff cannot thank you enough. Cynthia, you've been a rock star in this whole proceeding. I've watched you in every caucus meeting. You and Victoria have just been really, really specific and informative and clear, and I can't thank you enough for all of your hard work and dedication through this time period. For all of the members that have joined us today, thank you so much for having the interest. All 400 of you, thank you for sending your questions to the Thought Exchange. This is a living document, and there may be another town hall moving forward when we have more information. Obviously, Section 21 will be an evolution in regards to how we see ourselves moving forward. There will be probably changes to it down the road. If you have any questions that were not addressed today, please reach out to your caucus rep, send them to your caucus rep, who will send them to our business agents and our office, and we will get back to you on those questions. It may take us a little bit of time, but we will. And we thank you for all of your participation in today's event. I'd like to thank the staff, tireless staff, Anne Marie, Amanda, Aviva, everybody else for helping us put together this. Alan, Bill, Victoria, everybody that's not here on camera. We will do another town hall if we feel it's required, so stay tuned for that. And last but not least, there was today at the same time a EP, Entertainment Partners, put on an event about going paperless with deal memos and paperwork and all that sort of stuff. We reached out to them. They are recording it. It will be available to our membership later. We will be putting a link up probably on our newsletter that comes out every Wednesday. And for anybody that has missed this event, this has been recorded, and it will be put up on the YouTube channel over the next, probably early next week. So we encourage you to revisit it there. Thank you very much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. wash your hands, stay 6 feet apart, practice wearing your mask for 8 to 10 hours a day. It's like training for the Olympics. And respect your colleagues. We all want to go back to work in a safe, diverse and inclusive environment. And I can't thank you enough for letting me be your moderator today. I'll see you on the other side.
Thank you,
Annie. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. As Annie had mentioned, there's other ways to get your questions to us if they were unanswered, but she's not wrong. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and stay distant.